A founder recently told me HR was his worst business expense. He'd hired a people lead 9 months earlier, but nothing had changed. Attrition was still high, hiring was slow, and managers were still dumping every people related problem on his desk. I asked him three questions. Number one, did you approve the performance framework she built? He answered no. It sat on his desk for 4 months. The second question I asked was, did you let her run the compensation review? He also answered no. He actually overruled her recommendations. And the last question I asked was, did you tell your leadership team to bring people decisions to your HR lead? He also answered no, he did not. So this founder had spent 9 months actively preventing his new hire from doing her job, then labeled the hire a bad investment. This episode is about founders who invest in HR only to dismantle that investment from the inside. I'm going to cover the 5 most common ways that founders sabotage their own efforts, why it's so expensive, and the exact steps to fix it. Welcome back to the Organized Chaos podcast. I'm your host, Nahat Kerala. Over the last 15 years, I have helped more than 150 startups scale their teams as they've grown from 7 to 9 figures in revenue. If you're wondering why we're talking about founder sabotage, it's because the stakes couldn't be higher. Research from Noam Wasserman's book, The Founder's Dilemma, shows that 65% of startup failures stem from people problems. This includes things like co-founder conflict, poor hiring, or teams that can't execute together. CB Insights confirms this. Nearly a quarter of failed founders point to not the right team as the primary reason their company died. The data's clear here. People problems can kill a company. In this episode, I'm going to break down the specific ways that founders accidentally cause these issues and exactly how to fix them. Let's start with behavior number one, and I call this the I can do it all syndrome. This one shows up early, usually somewhere between 15 and 40 employees. It's when you hear founders say something like, I know my people better than anyone. I hired most of them, and I don't need a process for something I can handle in a conversation. That's true when you have 12 people, but it stops being true with every new hire you make. At 15 employees, you might be having 15 real conversations a month about performance, comp, and career growth. At 60 employees, if you're still the person those conversations run through, then you're having 60 individual conversations about these things. Every hire adds load to the founder, who's the same person that owns fundraising, product direction, and the customer relationship with your top customers. What happens next is very predictable. The conversations start getting shorter, then they get less frequent. Then they only happen when something is on fire. By the time you're at 80 people, the founder who was proud of knowing everyone is now the bottleneck on every promotion, raise, and termination. There's a second cost that is harder to see. When you're the only person who can make a people decision, your managers never learn how to make one. You're producing a management layer that can't manage. And 2 years later, you are frustrated that your directors escalate everything to you. Don't be, because you built that reality. Let's put this into perspective with some numbers. If a promotion decision waits 3 weeks for your attention and you're making 30 of those a year, you have added roughly 90 weeks of cumulative waiting across your company. Some of that waiting is harmless, but some of it will be the reason that a senior engineer accepted the recruiter's call because she'd been told a promotion or raise was coming soon for 2 quarters and counting. A similar version of this is the founder who insists on approving every job offer. That's fine when you're at 20 people, but when you hit 70 people, when your average offer approval sits in your inbox for 4 to 5 days and your competitors are moving in 24 hours, that approval step is costing you quality candidates. I'd ask you to check your own data on this. Pull your last 10 declined offers and look at how long each one sat waiting for an internal signature. The second behavior is when founders hire HR and then override every decision they make. This is the same behavior that I described in my opening story, and it's the most expensive and damaging of the five I'm going to be talking about. The pattern typically goes like this: the founder hires a head of people or people ops lead. On paper, the role has the correct mandate, a seat at the table, and the right level of authority to make things happen. But then the first meaningful decision comes up and the founder overrides it. Within the first 30 days, the whole company knows that the people lead is not the final decision maker. So employees start going around them. Managers will stop bringing any decisions to that individual because they know that the decision gets made elsewhere. So as a result, that HR lead stops proposing anything ambitious because she's learned what happens to her proposals. You've now got a senior salary producing junior output, all because of how you have sabotaged this person's decision rights. And let me be specific about what this costs. Say you're paying a head of people around 160,000 in base pay. Fully loaded with payroll taxes, benefits, and equipment, you're probably at around 200K a year. If this person is operating at half of their capability, you're burning $100,000 a year on capability that you've decided you do not want to use. And that's before you count the time it'll take to replace her when she leaves. And she will leave because good HR people will not stay in roles where they have accountability without the authority. Here's the test I give founders. Write down the 5 biggest people decisions that were made at your company last quarter. Now mark which ones your head of people decided without you. If that list is empty, then you are paying a senior salary for someone to do coordination work. What you need to do is hand at least 2 of those decisions over to them within the next quarter. The third behavior is holding HR to a different standard than the other functions. HR shows up on your P&L under the general and administrative category. It sits next to legal, finance, and office costs, meaning overhead. So anytime HR asks for budget, the default reaction is to scrutinize it more strictly than you would a request from any other department. When your VP of engineering comes to you asking for a fourth backend engineer, you don't ask her to build a financial model proving the return. If the budget is there, you are more likely to fund the request because you trust her judgment. But when HR comes and asks for a recruiter or a comp benchmarking study or 3 weeks to build a hiring process, you ask what the return is. Now, I want to add a caveat here because this argument can be misused. Every budget request at your company deserves scrutiny, and that includes HR. Handing your HR lead a blank check would be irresponsible, and I will be the first to tell you not to do it. All I'm saying is that you need to apply the same standard everywhere in your company. Scrutinize the HR request. Ask what the return is and what breaks if we wait 2 quarters before doing it. Then go ask engineering, sales, and marketing those exact same questions. When your HR lead gets cross-examined over a $15,000 comp study, while another department spends like drunken pirates and barely gets a follow-up question, you are indirectly telling the whole company what you think that function is worth. This issue deepens when you treat HR as a cost center rather than an investment. When you treat a department as a cost center, you simply cap its spending based on what's left over after the other teams take their share. But when you treat a function as an investment, you assign it clear targets and a budget that is designed to help them hit those targets. Think about your other departments. Sales has a revenue goal. Engineering has a roadmap with specific deadlines, and so on. Their budgets are built to hit those targets. Now ask yourself, what specific results have you asked your HR lead to drive? When I ask founders this question, they usually admit that they've never set any specific targets with their HR function. Yet, 18 months later, those same founders complain that HR doesn't drive results. Well, of course it doesn't. You never gave it a destination, but you are still judging it for not arriving there. Let me demonstrate this with a numerical example. Take a 60-person company with an average salary of 110K per year. If you have a 25% attrition rate, which is not uncommon for growing startups, that's 15 people walking out the door every single year. Gallup says it costs between 50 and 200% of an employee's salary to replace them. If we use a conservative 75%, then you are burning $1.2 million a year just replacing people that you already hired, onboarded, and trained. That is the trap that founders fall into. They cap their HR budget at $200,000, for example, to protect their cash runway, but then they let $1.2 million leak out the back door. HR costs show up on your P&L as a line item, but turnover costs are invisible. You don't see them because they don't hit your financial statements directly. But if you run the numbers, you will realize that you are spending way more on replacements than on your entire people department. So HR spend is visible and its return is usually invisible, which makes it genuinely hard to put a value on HR. As a founder, you see that 200K salary on the P&L every single month, but you never see the 4 bad hires that you didn't make or the top 3 performers who didn't quit. The solution here is to make the invisible return visible before you sit down and talk about budget. For example, if your company is growing quickly, ask your HR lead to report on these 4 numbers alongside your revenue metrics every quarter: voluntary attrition with the dollar cost attached, average days to fill, offer acceptance rate, and the cost of your open roles. When you start tracking the value that HR is protecting, it stops being an easy line item to cut. Behavior number 4 is avoiding the difficult conversations. This is the one founders are most private about, but it's also the one that does the most damage to everyone around them. You have a manager on your team who isn't cutting it. Everyone knows it and you know it. But the conversation just doesn't happen. Not for weeks and sometimes not even for a year. And the research backs this up. Nearly half of managers delay difficult conversations for weeks or months, mostly because they have never been trained on how to run them. Even HR leaders admit that they only trust about a third of their managers to handle a difficult performance conversation on their own. Founders fall into that same trap, but unlike your managers, nobody is holding you to a review cycle, so you can keep avoiding it indefinitely and just kicking that can down the road. This behavior impacts 3 groups. It lands on the underperformer, who spends several months more in a role that they are failing at without being told clearly what's expected and where they are underperforming. It impacts their team, who watch the standard drop and then adjust their own effort to match. And finally, this impacts your best people, who are watching to see whether being a top performer means anything at your company. When they conclude that it doesn't, they just leave. Every month you delay a difficult conversation, you are trading a difficult 30 minutes for another 30 days of somebody's career spent in a job that is not going to work for them. This hurts them, but also hurts your business. But there's a specific situation that troubles founders the most, and it's the co founder or early employee who can no longer fill their seat. Employee number 4 ran the supply chain team brilliantly at 5 people, but now is struggling when it's 12 people. The founder can see it as long as everyone else, but won't say anything because they were there since the beginning, and that loyalty weighs on them. If you're a founder, I would tell you to separate those 2 things in the conversation. Loyalty to the person is permanent and you should honor it, but the job that they occupy belongs to the company. Those 2 things can both be true, and then the conversation really gets much easier when you go in offering a different role rather than an exit. Some people will take it while others will decline it and leave, but that's still a better outcome than another year of a team that lacks effective leadership. These conversations seem like an ambush if you haven't been talking to your team all along. If you've been documenting what good looks like every quarter, then the final conversation shouldn't be a surprise. It's just the logical conclusion to the talks you've already had. Behavior number 5, buying the tool instead of building the practice. This is the most common behavior that I've seen in the last 2 years. You buy an HRIS, a survey platform, or some fancy AI performance tool, and you think, great, problem solved. But all this fancy HR software won't make decisions for you. If you plug a performance module into a company with no clear definition of what good looks like, all you're doing is creating very expensive and very organized noise. Don't get me wrong, I am all for automation. And if you've been following me for a while, you know how pro tech I am. But you have to define how your HR practice runs, then buy the tool to make it run better and faster. Buying the best HR tech in the world won't create a process that doesn't exist. So now that we've covered these 5 behaviors, I want to give you actionable steps for how to dig yourself out of them. Number 1, write down the decision rights. List every recurring people decision at your company, such as hiring approvals, comp changes, promotions, terminations, and org changes. Next to each one, I want you to write down the name of the person who decides and the one who was consulted before that decision is made. If your name is in the decision maker column more than 3 times as the founder, then you are becoming the bottleneck. Move at least 2 of those decisions to your HR lead or your managers this quarter and tell the company about it so they start going to those people instead of coming to you all the time. Number 2, commit to the override rule. When you disagree with your HR lead, have the discussion in private, but accept that sometimes you will lose the argument. I recommend giving yourself, as the founder, an override cap per quarter. I recommend no more than 2, and align with your HR lead on that. When you override a decision or a proposal, say why in writing and explain what would have to change for you to overturn your decision. The override rule is simply you setting a cap on how many times you can veto a decision or a proposal. And the reason this works is because it forces you as a founder to think hard about the decisions that you want to influence versus the ones that should stay with the HR lead. And it's a good way to actually train you to start handing more of the work that belongs in HR to HR. Number 3, apply one standard. Stop playing favorites with your budget. If you're grilling HR on costs but letting engineering spend freely, you are signaling what you actually value. Moving forward, ask every department head the same 3 questions. What is the ROI? What breaks if we delay this 6 months? And who's taking ownership of the outcome? Number 4, schedule the conversation that you've been avoiding. You know the one I'm talking about. Put it on the calendar within the next few weeks, and before the meeting, write down 3 specific examples of what is not working to drive the conversation. And number 5, define before you buy. Stop shopping for HR tools until you are crystal clear on how you will run your HR operation. Before you buy another piece of software, write 1 page on what process it supports and who's going to own it. If you can't articulate that, you aren't ready to buy. And this holds true even if your HR lead is doing this. Well, that's it for this episode. If you want help figuring out which of these 5 behaviors is costing you the most right now, that's exactly what I do in my HR diagnostic call. It is free, it takes 30 minutes, and you'll find the link in the show notes below. If any of this landed a little too close to home, I'd like to hear about it. You can send me an email to hello@organizedchaos.fyi or send me a message on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.